Hi, I'm Gail.
And hi, I'm Catherine. Welcome to Women Over 70 Aging Reimagined, our award-winning weekly podcast. Visit womenover70.com to learn how you may become involved, join Aging Reimagined Circle, and enjoy free participation in our online monthly programs. And special thanks to the North Shore Group of Wells Fargo Advisors for their ongoing support.
And today we're delighted to have in our studio Ann Lousin. Ann is 82. She was the first woman in the United States to be appointed as staff parliamentarian for the Illinois House of Representatives, as well as the first woman parliamentarian for any state legislature. Shortly after receiving her law degree in 1968, she was a research assistant at the 6th Illinois Constitutional Convention. Her long career has included government work and charitable projects, such as commemorating the 250th anniversary of women and minorities and 250th anniversary of women and minorities are equally important to her. And she taught at John Marshall Law School, University of Illinois, for 50 years. Ann, welcome to Women Over 70, Aging Reimagined. We can only
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We can only imagine that much has changed since you graduated law school in 1968. So you want to talk to us about what's different for women today?
Well, for women lawyers, it's a whole new world. I just can't believe it. I started law school 60 years ago this coming fall in 1965. There were 11 women in a class of 148 entering in the University of Chicago Law School at that time. That was double the national average, double, believe it. Now I have classes that I teach where not only are the majority of the students women, the men are really feeling very much as though they are in the minority. And one of them said to me, it's kind of nice ratio here, about 6 or 7 girls to 2 or 3 guys. But, it's a little odd for me. I said, you know what? I know exactly how you feel because I've been there in the reverse. It is what an enormous pool of talent we now have in the legal profession, in the medical profession, and what we now have with, frankly, a greater appreciation of homemakers. Now the New York Times no longer refers to some woman who is a stay-at-home mom as she was a homemaker. They say she manages the household. Now, that is absolutely correct. Managing a household, and it's a very, very difficult and important job.
And what do you think is compelling to women to be going to law school, other than they have access?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. Why did the men go to law school all of those years? It's a wonderful profession, difficult as it could be at times. You really can make a difference. You get a lot of prestige, frankly. You get a lot still to this day. There are people who say, oh, you are a lawyer, to both men and women. And immediately everybody kind of snaps to attention. It's the sort of thing that used to be reserved only for doctors. The my son, the doctor kind of concept. Now it's lawyers and doctors and the members of the professions generally, the CPAs. Look at all the women CPAs there now.
You're absolutely.
But I guess I have women who are CPAs who are now going to law school. They are going to become tax lawyers. Oh my God. How much better does it get in terms of earning a living, right?
Right. Very important. Yes, that's terrific. And so have there been any areas that you've been especially interested in the practice of law?
Yes, my work with the Illinois Constitutional Convention was absolutely pivotal. I always say that was the day one. for me in March of 1970 when I started at ConCon. That was the beginning of everything. I learned a lot about Illinois government and, more important, about people and group decision making. 116 delegates from all over the state, all very different people, but all of them coming to the convention to write what they hoped would be a new constitution for Illinois, how they worked it out. What an education that was. And I work quite a bit with the Illinois Constitution still to this day. I also teach commercial law. And particularly, I'm interested in international commercial law, which has exploded all over the world. As we learned this past week, there is no such thing as an American car that is totally made in America. You know, the point was made in the press. A car made in Detroit probably has half of its parts coming from Mexico, quite a few coming from Canada, coming from Japan. They're all over the world, and you see them in the container ships at the dock. So it's a whole new world in terms of commerce, a whole new world in interrelationship among governments. It's never a dull day.
Wow, that's tremendous. And also, I think some of your work is on commissions. Okay.
Yeah, I do a lot of, I like group decision making. You get to hear a lot of people's different viewpoints. It's hard for me to keep my mouth shut, but sometimes I do. And people express their views, and eventually they tend to come together. One thing I learned at ConCon was what I call Lousin's law of the second choice, which is people may have a first choice for a solution which is very different from everybody else's. So you've got 10 people, 10 separate first choices. But if you discover that over half of them have a second choice that is essentially the same, that's where you're going to end up with the second choice. And nobody will be terribly happy, but also nobody will be terribly unhappy either.
Is that the nature of compromise?
Not sure I'd call it compromise as much as it is. Everybody does have a second choice, what I call a plan B sometimes. And we all, well, I can't get everything I want, but these people have their needs, particularly legislators or ConCon delegates. They have to go home and try to explain things to their constituents. And I think everybody had better understand that. Other people are going to have to deal with their own pressures upon themselves.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's so
How
true.
are you known in that you say you really like group decision making? How do people know you in that context?
Through ConCon. A lot of people know me through ConCon. When I meet judges, especially Illinois State Court judges, they say, "Oh yes, you're the one who was at ConCon." I got to tell you, of all of the staff and the delegates, obviously the Grim Reaper has taken its toll. So there are maybe 20 or 30 of us still around from the staff and the delegate group who are still able to talk to people. And some of them are retired to God knows where, like Florida, and they, I can't find them. But it's a precedent to call people who were at ConCon. There are relatively few of us, and that the press know me and the judges know me mostly through ConCon. And then the other thing, of course, is having taught for 50 years at John Marshall, now UIC Law. One thing is, I have had now about 6,000 students, and I'm not exaggerating. So when I walk across the loop in the summer, if I'm walking with somebody who doesn't know the situation, that person is always astonished that I can't go more than one block without somebody waving a hand and saying, "Hello, Professor, remember me?" Like 30 years ago, right?
So, what would you tell younger students who are in law school? What would you tell them why they should go into commercial law?
One thing that I heard from one of my teachers in law school, a remarkable woman named Soya Menchikov, who was one of the outstanding commercial lawyers in the United States, and of course, one of the early women law professors. She said, a man who's afraid of going to prison is afraid, very afraid. But a man who's afraid of losing his business is scared too. And you shouldn't be denigrated, say, well, it's only money. Money is what keeps that guy and his wife and children eating and housed, right? So I would say, one of the things you should learn about commercial law is that this is pretty much what keeps the American economy going, and this is why people are able to pay their bills, frankly.
That makes sense. Yes. And is it even more important today that attorneys specialize in commerce law?
Well, they're stuck. It's very hard not to specialize. I like to learn everything about any different area of the law that I can, reasonably understand. Obviously not advanced tax, but, or advanced engineering patents. But frankly, all of it comes together. All of it is together. For instance, how do you get a monopoly in commerce? The way you get a monopoly in commerce today is through having intellectual property. You have a patent, you have a copyright. That's how all of these tech billionaires got to be billionaires, because of intellectual property. So all of it comes together.
And you mentioned the Grim Reaper, and Gail tells me that you have a particular interest in the medical right to die, medical aid in dying.
Yeah, this is something I've seen over the years. People I've known have been in a very difficult situation. I have watched the development of the power of attorney for healthcare and the living will. I have a power of attorney for healthcare. I have a living will in addition to my standard, living trust and pour over will that everybody should have. And I've indicated when I want them to stop keeping me on life support. This was not an issue back in the early 1970s when I worked for the legislature. I should say it was just beginning. We started having people whose families said, our loved one may not be suffering, but he or she is there in a hospital bed, unaware of what's going on. It's costing the hospital money. We no longer have insurance, and nobody really knew what to do. I started working on some of the early bills on this, helping to draft them, and I worked with people at hospitals, and they said something I had never realized. The families fall apart when they have to make this decision, and they don't realize it. One social worker nurse type said to me, the children of a woman who's dying will all of a sudden revert to childhood. Well, Mom always loved you more than she loved me, and now you want to pull the plug on her. And 2 months later, they will completely forget they ever said that. So we have to have a formal legal structure for all of this, because the families should not have to make that kind of a decision when they're in the worst possible situation to make a rational decision. I like the fact that I've told my family what my wishes are. I said, and these are my wishes. If I change them, I'll let you know. But otherwise, you all have a copy of my power of attorney for healthcare. Yes. And look at that. That brings together religion, spirituality, social justice, medical liability, family dynamics. Everything comes together.
Illinois, there's a bill in the front of the Illinois legislature for medical aid in dying, and it's just been postponed for a vote in the Senate. And are you keeping, watching this progress in the Illinois?
Not very closely, but it happens every year. It is an enormous issue about the actual right to die. It really should be somebody making a decision ahead of time. But the question is that person still, as we say, compos mentis, able to make a mental decision? You have to hope that that person is not being unduly influenced by a family member who doesn't want to have all of that end-of-life expense in a hospital.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Wow. So, how do you think about your age now? And are you thinking about your age now?
Well, I'm actually pretty lucky. My doctor says, for a woman your age, you're doing well. And I said, let's strike that preface there, for a woman your age. I'm doing well. And she says, your physical problem is essentially arthritis, which means I have a mobility issue. It takes me longer to get places. And sometimes I have to ask people for help. Fortunately, the brain is still functioning. As you hear, the mouth is still functioning. So I think I've been pretty lucky. And what's amazing is at a certain age, people really should cut back on what the number of things that they are doing. And society should realize that those of us over 65, 70, even over 80, have a lot to contribute. And not just sitting around baking cookies for the younger generation or acting as advisors. I sincerely hope that Joe Biden will be able to find something to do to be able to help this country from his situation as essentially a retiree or a semi-retiree, because there's a lot he remembers that he can share with everybody else. There are a lot of decisions he can help make.
Yes, for sure.
So, I'm interested in your charitable project, being the 250th anniversary of Cohegan Native Americans.
No, it's a bit of the American Revolution. Illinois had nothing to do, at least practically, with the American Revolution. But we have a commission put out by the Illinois Humanities Council that is very concerned about making sure that Illinoisans observe the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. This coming next month, on April the 18th, will be the 250th anniversary of that famous ride in Longfellow's poem, on the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive, of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, And so we have to rethink this about every generation, and we should really rethink what may have really happened. We now know far more about history now that so much is digitized. Another thing I'm very interested in, and so far I've gotten a lot of sympathy, but nothing else, is the role of Native Americans in Illinois. We know very little about it. Has anybody ever heard of Kitty Howard? Does that mean anything to you? Kitty Howard was a Potawatomi Indian woman who married Jean-Baptiste Fondu-Sable, who was probably half French white and half black. He was probably the son of a woman enslaved by his father. And he is known as the father of Chicago. The city council just renamed Lakeshore Drive the Jean-Baptiste de Fondu-Sable Drive. Excuse me. Jean-Baptiste Fondu-Sable had a wife, and together they ran that trading post at where Chicago River and Michigan Avenue come together. what is now called DuSable Plaza. His bust is up. Nothing about her, right? Nobody's ever heard of her. So I've suggested we name that area Kitty Hawa's Landing, because she ran the store. She certainly ran the household. She ran the farm. She ran the dairy. She ran the wheat grinding mill that they owned. She was what the New York Times now calls managing the household, right? She also managed from accounts. She managed the store. She ran the whole thing. And he was the outside guy. You know, he was the one negotiating with the traders coming up the river. Come on. She deserves some credit, too. Why don't we call her the mother of Chicago?
Yes.
You said you're getting some interest in this, but not support yet.
Not where I would call it important support. I've spoken to the Edgewater Historical Society about it. They're interested. One of these days, I am going to grab an alderman and say, you know, you guys really missed the boat here. You could have named it after him and her both. If you're going to go around renaming, how about something for Kitty Hawa?
I think you should work on this hard. Absolutely. Yes.
And
So-
you know what? The answer I've gotten from a few politicians is, I've never heard of her.
We hadn't either.
No, and that's not a good enough answer.
I said, what was she, invisible? She probably did not know much English. Okay. So what?
Right. Have you lived in the city of Chicago your whole life?
Basically, I have. I went to college in Iowa, so I basically lived there. And of course, I lived in Germany and Europe generally for a year between college and law school. But otherwise, I've been a Chicagoan. Of course, I worked in Springfield between 1970 1975. But as I always say, I've always voted in Chicago.
Yes.
And by the way, I am a graduate of the Chicago Public Schools K through 12.
Yes.
I'm proud of it.
That's wonderful. Yeah. As am I, a graduate of the Chicago Public Schools, and proud of it. Right. And so what's next for you? You're continuing to work on the American Revolution.
Oh, yeah, American Revolution. I'm revising a book I wrote on the Illinois Constitution. I'm still working on my courses. Tonight, I'm going to be teaching my seminar on the Illinois Constitution, a class I've been teaching now for about 12 years. And I am working in two directions, commercial law and then the Illinois Constitution. One of the things I regularly do is write articles for especially the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin on very short articles on how to understand some legal issues of the present and of the past.
Mm-hmm.
So, as citizens of Illinois, what would you want us to know about the Illinois Constitution and major changes that have been made or are in the making?
Well, the amazing thing to me is a number of state constitutions were revised shortly after 1970, and they paid us the great compliment of copying things. Montana is taking a lot of pleasure in people talking about their environmental protection section. Well, the 1972 Montana Constitution's right to a healthful environment is taken 90% verbatim from the Illinois Constitution of 1970. And we were also the first state to have a provision on that is called basically ERA, the first state constitution to have a gender discrimination ban. Also, the first state constitution to have a ban on what was called the handicap. Now, that was the phrase at the time. We now would refer to disabled or partially disabled, but the term in 1970 was handicap. Those were, I think, some real advances. Obviously, after 50, 60 years, you have to keep rethinking things. One thing that I've been beating the drums about, and people look at me and say, yeah, you're right, but I won't do anything about it, is what the climatologists are telling me. I know quite a few climatologists who say the whole issue of the climate crisis will affect mostly, and first of all, the people who live on the equator and the people who live in the Arctic and Antarctic. There are going to be mass movements to the central areas, and that will include Illinois. Illinois, despite our comments about our weather, has a relatively moderate climate. We're not on the equator and we're not in the Arctic. So we are going to get a lot more Venezuelans who are suffering from starvation because there is a drought in Venezuela. They're going to try to keep coming up here. We can't stop them unless, of course, we want to put an army down on the Mexican border and shoot everybody. And somehow or another, I don't think we want to do that. And so I think that's something we're all going to have to confront. We're also going to have to confront certain climate changes here. Fortunately, we have a great big pond that we call Lake Michigan. And we have a lot of freshwater rivers, don't we? And we're going to have to rethink what we want to do with the lake and with the rivers. That could be our source of fresh water.
We need you to keep working on these issues, and we certainly appreciate your working on these issues. So, any last questions or comments? Anne? Catherine?
Go ahead, Anne.
I don't know. My mother lived to 90. She was born in 1909 and she died in 1999. And people used to ask her when she turned 90, what have you seen in 90 years? Which on the face is really a very dumb question, obviously. And she said, when I was born, women did not have the right to vote. Both of my daughters are college professors. That's the change. She remembered in 1920, her mother, age 41, putting on her hat and coat in November 1920 and saying, I'm going to be gone for an hour. I am going down to the polling booth to vote. To vote. What an event that must have been for my grandmother.
Right.
And my mother lived to see my sister get a PhD and me to get a law degree and be well on into our careers. And she herself had a bachelor's degree, and she always said, I cannot understand people who can't read or don't want to read. And I can't understand anybody who thinks women should not be educated. Women can do anything.
What a legacy. That's what.
Thank you so much, Anne, for being with us today. You are an inspiration for sure.
And listeners, we would like to see more of you at our monthly programs. Make your voice heard as together we change the conversation about women aging. Visit Age and Reimagine Circle on womenover70.com. Thanks for listening. And another podcast you might find especially relevant is Jennifer Fink's Fading Memories. Now, this podcast is for caregivers of loved ones with dementia. It provides insights and guidance on communicating effectively, managing stress, and coping with grief and loss. And we'll see you next week.